Hi guys, so in this video we're going to look at how using your GPU in your server when passed through to a VM or having the Unraid Nvidia or AMD drivers installed can affect the power efficiency on the server. Sounds interesting? Then let's get started. Hi there everyone. So today's video is not going to be so much as a tutorial, but just kind of talking over some various ideas. Now to be honest, I didn't really plan on making this video at all. I've actually been working on a couple of videos looking at two new graphics cards, the AMD RX 6800 and the Nvidia RTX 3080. So look out for some videos towards the end of this week where I test how well these graphics cards perform in Unraid and Unraid VMs. So just what have those videos that I've been working on got to do with this video now? Well, when I test a graphics card, I always like to see how much power it pulls from the wall. Not only when it's passed through to a VM and doing gaming or something, but also when it's just idle in the server as well. You know, because most of us, we have our servers running 24/7. So it's interesting to see how adding a new graphics card will affect the power draw of the server when it's just doing its normal everyday tasks. So during this testing, I found out something that really surprised me and was totally the opposite of what I thought it was going to be. So I wanted to share these results of how you might be able to save a lot of power on your server as well by using the GPU in the server in a slightly different way than we might naturally think is best. And we'll be taking a look at both Nvidia and AMD graphics cards, as in these tests they perform slightly differently. But let's just jump straight in, and I'm going to show you some interesting things when I was testing the RTX 3080. Okay, so here we are on one of my servers that has an X470 motherboard, a Ryzen 9 5950X and 64 gigs of RAM. Now this server, I don't use it for anything but VMs, so it's just got one disk in the array, an NVMe, and another SSD is an unassigned device. And other hardware in this server, well, I've got two graphics cards, an Nvidia GT710 as primary, and the new RTX 3080 as a secondary card. Now at the moment there's nothing running on this server at all, no VMs or Docker containers are running, so the server sitting idle, you can see here, is pulling 124 watts from the wall. And for those of you wondering how I'm measuring this power draw, I made this from a Sonoff smart plug that can measure power draw, and I flashed it with what's called the Tasmotor firmware, and as you can see here you can just log into a web server and view the power draw and turn it on and off, etc. from there. Personally, I don't turn mine on and off from here. This and all of my other smart home devices all go into Home Assistant, and for devices which can record power usage, I like to put this data out into a graph so that I can see the data usage over time. Anyway, before I start rambling on totally off topic, let's actually start up a VM with the RTX 3080 pass through and have a look at the power draw then. Now, as expected, as the VM starts up, the power usage goes right up, but let's see what the power usage goes to when the operating system is actually fully loaded up and so the graphics driver kicks in. Okay, so that's interesting. So now the power draw of the server is around 100 watts. You know, it's fluctuating probably between 95 and 104, but seems to stay around the 100 mark. Okay, so now this is quite interesting because the power draw on the server now is about 25 to 30 watts less than it was when the VM wasn't running and the graphics card wasn't passed through. Now I haven't logged into the VM, so there's nothing actually running. Obviously if I started up a game or something, the power usage is going to go way up, but at this point at the login screen the graphics driver has loaded, but now it seems because the graphics driver is being used that the power usage of the card is much less. Now I didn't really expect this, to be honest. I thought that when the graphics card wasn't being used it would probably be in the lowest power state that it could actually be, but obviously that isn't the case. Having the graphics driver loaded into a VM that isn't actually doing anything is actually saving quite a lot of power. So the interesting test now would be is because in Unraid 6.9 and onwards we can easily load the Nvidia drivers to the Unraid OS, then what's going to be the power draw if we do that? So let's have a look. So as you can see I've installed the drivers now, so I'm going to reboot the server. So let's log in. And first I'm actually going to go to the dashboard here where I've got the GPU plugin, which gives me a little bit of statistics about the Nvidia GPU that's installed. We can see here it says it's using 91.7 watts out of 320 watts. That does seem a bit high to me. I'm not sure if that's 100% accurate or not. So let's go across and have a look at the power draw from the server as a whole. Okay, so it's still using about the same as before, you know, around 125, 126 watts. Now, I really did expect that it was going to be using about the same with the Unraid Nvidia driver installed as it would be when it's passed through to the Windows VM with the Nvidia driver installed there. So could it be that the Nvidia Windows driver is just better written and more power efficient than the Linux version? Well, let's check that and actually load up a Pop! OS VM with the Linux Nvidia driver installed there. Okay, so again the power draws drop right down. It's going as low as 90 here. You know, so that's 38 watts lower power draw than when using the Nvidia driver installed on Unraid OS. But I've actually got two Nvidia GPUs installed on this server. And the RTX 3080 is the secondary card, so the primary card is actually the GT710. So maybe the Unraid driver only actually kind of uses and will be able to control the primary graphics card. So let's swap the graphics card around, making the RTX 3080 the primary, and test again. Okay, so as you can see the graphics cards are now swapped around, the RTX 3080 being the primary. So let's see what the power draw is like this. Well, it's certainly not any lower. It's about 133 watts now, actually slightly higher. Maybe that's just margin of error, I don't know, but it's certainly not any lower swapping the graphics cards around. So that didn't do anything at all. So my last thought with the Nvidia drivers on Unraid is maybe because Unraid's not actually using the drivers, then they're kind of not actually kicking in. So maybe if I actually start up the Unraid server in GUI mode with only the RTX 3080 attached, maybe then, because it will be using it for the display, then we might see a lower power draw. Okay, so now the server only has the one graphics card, the RTX 3080 installed. So what we want to do is get a baseline reading with just the one graphics card. We can see here that the power draw is about 115 watts with only one graphics card. So the GT710 was probably using maybe around 10 watts when it was installed. So now I'm going to reboot the server and boot it into GUI mode and see if there's any difference in power usage. Okay, so the server's back up again, still just the RTX 3080, and now we can see the power draw, it has dropped right down. So now with GUI mode the driver's actually being used and it's doing something. So the power draw's dropped right down. Here we can see it's around 82-83 watts. And if we go across to the dashboard and have a look at the GPU plugin there, and we can see here now that this is reporting that the power draw on the card is only 7.57 watts. And it says there's one session running here, which is the Unraid GUI mode. So the Unraid server started in GUI mode or GUI mode is actually using the GPU, so therefore the driver's being used correctly and the card's using less power. Well, so this is all very well and good, but for me there's one caveat that's a total deal breaker. If the GPU is being used in GUI mode, you can't pass it through to a VM. It may crash your server or the VM just won't start. So for some people that might be fine if they only use that GPU for transcoding, but if you want to use that GPU with a VM, then we can't use GUI mode. We're going to have to boot the server in the normal mode, and then under those circumstances having the driver installed won't save us any power usage. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the testing I did with an Nvidia GPU, and in a moment we'll test the same but with an AMD GPU instead. But first, let's just recap over the results that I found that I got with my Nvidia GPU. So the Nvidia driver, when it's in use, it does have power saving features, and it will mean that you'll use less power than if you weren't using the driver at all. However, for the driver to be able to save power, it must be doing something, like it must be outputting to a display. So using the Unraid Nvidia driver in a server that doesn't use GUI mode won't save you any power at all. However, if you want to use GUI mode with Unraid, and you have the Nvidia driver installed, then you're not going to be able to use that GPU for pass-through with a VM. However, if you only use that GPU for transcoding, then it does make sense to install the Nvidia driver and boot the server in GUI mode, because when the server is not transcoding anything, it will still be using the GPU for a session with the display output, so when the server isn't transcoding anything, it's going to be using less power because of this than if you didn't actually boot the server up in GUI mode. But if you use your GPU for VM pass-through, then you're going to use less power if you never shut the VM down. Now of course, for this to be true, the VM can't be doing anything. Now you can't be mining crypto when you're not using the VM and think you're going to save power. If you do, you're going to really cry when that power bill comes through. But when you're not using the VM, if you just log off, then you're going to save a bunch of power. So for example, I found I was saving about 25 watts by leaving the VM running all the time. So let's say we use the VM for gaming for maybe 6 hours a day. So that leaves 18 hours where it's idle. So that's 18 hours where we'll be saving 25 watts. So to work that out in kilowatt hours per day, what we need to do is multiply the watts by the amount of hours in the day that we use it and then divide by 1000. So for me, I'll be saving 0.45 kilowatt hours per day, or 13.5 kilowatt hours a month, or by the year I'll be saving 164.25 kilowatt hours. And for me in the UK, I get charged 17.76 pence per kilowatt hour. So if I multiply that by 164.25, which is £29.17 saving a year, which isn't a huge amount of money, but let's face it, for less than that I can buy a 250 gig SSD off Amazon. Okay, so now let's move on to the second part of this video where we look at the power usage with an AMD GPU. Okay, so here I am on another server here. This one's got very similar hardware to the other one. It's got the older 3950X as the CPU, and it's got 128 gigs of RAM. On this server there's a proper array unlike the other one, and graphics card wise, the primary graphics card, which is this one here, which is an AMD Radeon RX 580. I've got this secondary graphics card here, a bit of a strange one. It's an old graphics card from the 1990s, a Cirrus Logic one, and I use this one along with the Sound Blaster card you can see here to be able to run old VMs with hardware pass-through such as Windows 95 and Windows 98. So in these tests I've got the Docker service turned off and there's no VMs running, but I've made sure that all of the drives are spun up. So the amount of power this is using at the moment is 130 watts, well, give or take a couple of watts. So let's find out what happens if I start up a VM. We'll use this Pop! OS VM with the RX 580 pass through. Let's start this one up, and whilst it starts, let's go back over to the power menu. Okay, and we can see a drop now. Starting up this VM has dropped the power consumption by about 15 watts. So the power usage is anywhere between 112 to 114 watts. So running the VM is obviously making a difference. The graphics card isn't using as much power as when it's in an idle state. So we can see here the power consumption is now down to 110 watts, fluctuating up to about 112. So the power drop is about 20 watts. So by having this VM running, I'm saving 20 watts of power consumption on the server. So let's stop this VM. So now the VM's stopped, let's go back across to the power meter. Okay, so this is interesting. So having started and stopped the VM now, the power usage hasn't gone up to as high as it was before. You know, we're sitting at just beneath 120 watts. So stopping the VM has increased the power consumption by about kind of 8, maybe 9 watts. So let's just go back onto the main tab. Yeah, all of the drives are still spun up, so there's no difference there. So definitely having stopped the VM, the power consumption has gone up a little bit, but not as much as it was before. So, you know, I don't know why, but that's pretty interesting. So the next thing we should try is, because I'm on Unraid 6.9, I'm on the RC2 version here, as well as being able to load the Nvidia drivers, we can also load the AMD drivers too. So I'm going to load the AMD drivers into Unraid and see if that makes any difference to the power consumption. So to do that we need to drop into a terminal window, and we need to create a folder on the flash drive called modprobe.d. So let's type mkdir space / boot, that's into the flash drive, and then into the config folder, so / config and / modprobe.d. So that creates a folder which Unraid looks in when it boots up, and inside that folder, if we make a file called AMD GPU.conf, it will load the AMD drivers. So to do that we just need to use the touch command, which will create basically an empty file, and we want to create it in boot config modprobe.d and the file name AMD GPU.conf. So let's just quickly have a look inside and just check everything is as we expect it to be. So there's the folder we just created there. Yep, that's good. So let's have a look inside of there. And there's the file. So now we can reboot the server and it should load those drivers up and we should be good to go. Okay, so the server's rebooted. Let's log in. Okay, so let's have a look at the power usage now. Now, for all of you that have seen this at the bottom here, that my UPS is consuming 296 watts of power. Well, that's because I got multiple devices plugged into this UPS. It isn't just this server. So ignore what this says here. Anyway, let's go back across to the power monitor. Okay, so we are actually using less power with the driver installed on this server with an AMD graphics card. Okay, so we can see here the power usage is only 120 watts, so it's about 10 watts less than without having the driver installed. So it's about the same as a moment ago when we started the VM and we saw the power usage drop down to about 110 watts, and then when we stopped the VM it stabilised at this. So that's pretty interesting. So I think what we should do is actually start up the VM again now and see what happens to the power usage now. Okay, so now we can see the power usage has dropped down to kind of 113 watts. So again, it's kind of lower power usage, but it'd be interesting to see what happens when we stop the VM, what it actually goes back up to. So let's do that now. Okay, so as expected, stopping the VM has upped the power again, up to around what it was before we started it. And so without a VM running, the power draw is less when the graphics driver is installed on Unraid, but it's not quite as good as when we pass through the GPU to the VM. So the final test that we can do is actually start up the server in GUI mode and see what the power draw is then. So let's do that now. Okay, so the server started back up in GUI mode and the AMD drivers are loaded. All of these disks are spun up. So let's see what the power draw is now. Okay, so it's 107, 108 watts. So that's actually a little bit less than when we actually had the graphics card pass through to a VM with the driver. But really just that couple of watts, that could just be margin of error. Now, one thing that happens with the Nvidia graphics card is when the driver's loaded in GUI mode, if you start up a VM, it will either crash the server or not run at all. So let's see what happens with the AMD driver loaded if we can actually start a VM. Okay, so with the AMD drivers and GUI mode, we can actually start up the VM. I can see the Apple login screen on my monitor here. So now with the GPU passed through, let's check the power draw again. Okay, so pass through to a VM, the power draw is less again. Now obviously all of these readings, they're not kind of really scientific, but basically you do get much better power usage if you have a driver being used with the GPU than if you don't. And in all cases it always seems to be the most efficient power usage if the driver being used is the result of the graphics card being passed through to a VM. Okay, so that brings us to the end of all the tests that I did. So now just to wrap up, let's just recap through the things that I discovered during my tests. Now remember, your results might be totally different to mine. I'm sure you've got different hardware to me. But if you do some tests, then just let us know in the comments below, if you had the same or different results to what I had in my test. So with an Nvidia or AMD GPU, the lowest power usage is when the GPU is passed through to a VM that's idle. Now with an Nvidia GPU, having the driver loaded in Unraid OS doesn't affect power usage at all. Now this is true unless the GPU is the primary GPU and you're booted in GUI mode. Doing this will save power, but you shouldn't boot the server in GUI mode if the Nvidia GPU is primary and you want to use it to pass through to VMs. However, if the Nvidia GPU is primary and you only use it for transcoding and you never use that GPU for pass-through, then you will save power by booting in GUI mode with the driver installed in Unraid OS. Now with AMD GPUs, loading the driver in Unraid OS, it does result in lower overall power usage. So I definitely recommend installing the AMD driver no matter what. But to get the absolute optimum power usage from your GPU, the best results is if you pass the GPU through to a VM, and when you're not using the VM, just have it idling and log out. With the drivers loaded and the server booted in GUI mode with the AMD GPU as primary, then the power saving is actually better than when it's booted in standard mode. I would say it's roughly the same as having a GPU pass through to a VM. So now what I do differently with my server since having done these tests I just boot my server in normal mode because I don't really like booting it in GUI mode at all, to be honest. I don't know, it just kind of feels wrong to me. But all of my VMs that have a graphics card passed through, they don't ever get shut down. I just log out of them to try and save a bit of power. Anyway guys, I know this video's been a bit different than my normal ones, but I hope you did find it useful and you enjoyed it. Now if you did, then please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, I want to thank the great people that make these videos possible. A big thank you to all of my patrons and supporters out there. Thank you so much guys for enabling me to make these videos. Now if there's anyone out there who wants to join this great bunch of people, then please see the links in the description below. Anyway guys, it's time for me to go now, but whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you in the next video.